Hello?
Hey, Rich, it's Larson. You got a minute?
Sure, Larson. What's up?
Well, hello and welcome to the Got a Minute podcast. This is Larson Hicks, and I'm joined by my co-host, Rich Lusk. Pastor Rich, how you doing, sir?
Yeah, great to be with you, Larson, as always.
We had a really fun interview last week with Caleb Bird on the topic of IVF. That is, I've been thinking a lot more about that, Rich. I felt like, as somebody who I think considers myself pretty pro-life, I was pretty staggered, by the fact that there is, if I remember correctly, like almost orders of magnitude more. Essentially murders and deaths happening through IVF than abortion, which was shocking.
Right. Yeah. And what's also shocking is the fact that so many Christians who are pro-life are just not educated about IVF and how it works and what all's involved and really what it's doing. So hopefully our podcast will help.
Yeah, that was a great, anyway, if you haven't listened to that one yet, check it out. I'm sure it's out by the time this thing gets published. So this week we've got, so it's kind of a theme here on Got a Minute. We had, we did a number of episodes on George Gilder's book, which is kind of about masculinity and touches on, work and some of those things. We had David Bahnsen on the show a couple weeks ago talking about his new book, Full Time. I had on my own just kind of personal podcast, I had Michael Foster and Santiago Pliego a couple weeks ago talking also about work. And so it's kind of a theme. It's in the air. It's clearly something that I think needs to be talked about. I think needs to be talked about a lot more in the church, especially. And so I'm really thrilled that today we're getting to have a couple of guests on the show, Kyle Hessler and Pastor Steve Jeffrey from the Fort Worth area. They are putting on a conference called Works Based, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. And they've got a bunch of speakers lined up, including Pastor Jeffrey, but you also have Darren Doan. You've got Andrew Crappy-Shetz, Pastor Wiley, Dave Reese from Armored Republic, and David Bahnsen. So a pretty awesome cast of folks that are going to be speaking on this topic. And I think I've got a trip or something, like a work trip or something that's already booked, because as soon as I saw that, I went and checked my calendar because it looks like such an awesome event. So thank you guys for being on the show. We're looking forward to talking more about this with you.
It's good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So Pastor Jeffrey, I came on your show a while ago. We talked about like red pill addiction, I think. That was a really fun conversation. I'm sure that was sent out to our church, so people at our church probably are familiar with you, but maybe we could ask you first to give a quick intro on you and your background.
Sure. So my name's Steve Jeffrey. I'm married to the wonderful Nicole. I have 3 kids, Ben, Becky, and Abby, the oldest 2 of whom are at college. Ben and Becky, and Abby wishes she could be, and Lord willing will be at some point soon. I'm one of the pastors here at All Saints Presbyterian Church, where I serve alongside Pastor Jeff Shaw. Pastor Jeff Neal was here for many years, since 2010 or 2009. He's recently left to lead our first church plant in Granbury, Texas, 45 minutes to the southwest of us, where there are now 100 and something people, mostly people who left us here, but also some new arrivals down there at Christ Covenant in Granbury. So that leaves Pastor Shaw and me trying to hold the fort here and keep people like Kyle in order, which is a lot of fun. Previously, I was a pastor in London. You can probably tell from my accent, I'm not from this part of Texas. And so I was a pastor at Emmanuel in North London from its founding in 2009. And before that, I was the assistant pastor, and before that, I was a seminarian. Before that, I worked at a church. Before that, I was a physicist. and I'd always wanted to be an academic physicist, and the Lord had other plans. So here I am, pastoring the church. I should also say, by the way, just in order to give credit where credit is due, I'm not one of the organisers of the Works-Based Conference. That is not at all to distance myself from it. I just want credit to go to the man who is. I'm just the most cheerful enthusiast cheering from the sidelines, and I'm really excited about it. I've been one of the speakers, and also Kyle is the kind of guy in the congregation who is just fantastic to have around, because he's always wanting to serve Christ in the kind of vocational context. And when he talked to me about the Works-Based Conference idea, I thought, that sounds fantastic. How can I get in on this? And it turns out he already had a plan for me to be. So there I am. Yeah. So yeah, that's me, and it's nice to be with you guys.
Well, it's great to hear. Great to hear about the church plant in Texas. It's exciting to hear and see that God's moving and working and growing the church in other parts of the country. So that's encouraging. All right, Kyle, give us the rundown, man. What's your story?
So my name's Kyle Hessler. I'm a husband to Jenny, father to Theoden and Stonewall. I'm a member here at All Saints. I believe in good standing.
Yeah, very good standing.
Where Steve definitely keeps an eye on me.
For now.
But I've been in the CRC for almost 5 years. And so big fan of work vocation. I'm a sales rep for multiple companies. I own a couple different entrepreneurial endeavors, and really I just had a desire to kind of have a networking event and a conference where we could kind of explore some of these ideas, because I love work. I'm not a work with my hands kind of guy, but I'm definitely a connector. Malcolm Gladwell has a book called Connector, and I really identified with that book in terms of like I can kind of put this guy in touch with this guy and so on and so forth. And so I really wanted to just do something because I'll go to different conferences that are CRC related or just broader, and they have some good elements of this, but they're lacking in the business side. So I really wanted to emphasize that and kind of blow it up and have a bigger event that's related to that.
Yeah. Very cool.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Well, I'm excited for you guys, and I'll just say this is we maybe have talked about this before, Kyle. I visited your church I don't know, a year ago when I was traveling on business, and I know we got to chat a little bit. But I'm a huge I'm a huge fan of events. This is just a plug for this idea for churches across the country. I was a concert promoter for 7 years or something, put on about 100 concerts and a music festival. And when we planted this church, one of the first things I did was organize a conference that Rich spoke at, along with Bodie Bauckham and George Grant and a bunch of great folks, Michael Foster. And
I refer to it as the time that Bodie and I packed the place out.
That's right. That's right.
You're the headliner.
Exactly. But it was the concept in my mind was, something that we've talked a lot about, maybe mentioned with you, Steve, before, was this idea that like when we were planting this church, we weren't on mission to CREC people. We're not looking for CREC people. Like we know we'll find them. They'll find us. Not worried about that. We're on mission to our friends, our neighbors, people at other churches in Huntsville. And so we started kind of trying to think about who are the future members of TRC, of our church in Huntsville. Where are they? What kind of speaker would they like to come listen to? And it's like, they would love to hear from Rich. They just have never heard of Rich. Right. And so I want them to hear Rich. I want them to hear Michael Foster. I want them to hear Ben Merkel and George Grant, but they've never heard of those people. Who have they heard of? And it was like, well, the obvious one was Bodie Bauckham. So it was that kind of idea that we wanted to get Bodie to draw a bunch of potential future members of our church together, to hear a bunch of people that are more, Bodie's on our team for sure, across a lot of dimensions, but guys like Rich are even closer. Right. And so, anyway, that's I feel like events are this there's this urgent sort of deadline that people have to make a decision. It's not like yeah, maybe I'll check that out someday, or maybe I'll watch that video someday. It's like, yes or no, are you there?
Right.
If you pre-sell tickets at a lower rate, then it sort of incentivizes people to commit to it, and then they start evangelizing their friends. So anyway, I love events for people in church planting, or just involved with the church that you feel like could use some help, growing. I think about events. Great way.
Well, I want to throw something else into the pot there, which speaks to the character of this event. And Kyle described it as a networking event and conference. And really, that's one of the things that appealed to me about it most. There are lots of places to get good content in the sense of teaching and input. Some of the stuff that I'll be talking about, some of it will be familiar. I hope there'll be some places in which I'm able to push people a little bit theologically. But to hear from some of these practitioners in the workplace, and more importantly, the networking event point, Kyle has really made a big thing out of. This is not just an opportunity to hear about work and to think about work. It's an opportunity to work. Like we're praying, and Kyle has been working to the end, that people will make contacts here and get ideas here and actually meet people here with whom they're going to be able to generate new businesses or new employment opportunities for themselves, or refresh their existing employment for themselves. It's actually going to be a context within which work is done in a new way, as well as a context in which we can hear about work. So I've taught about work here many times, men's discipleship breakfasts and in sermons and on podcasts and so on. And it's like what Works-Based is seeking to do is to take all that and over a couple of days move it to the next level and say, look, here's how to seek to either develop your career or start your next business or start your first business or move out of one job into another or reorient what you're doing or just maybe start something completely new. Just learn from the people who actually are doing the business on the front lines how to go about building businesses in practice. It's exciting to me.
And I was just going to say, Larson, you're probably the first person I've talked to kind of preparing for this conference that probably your concert background is similar to my background. I just recently stopped doing this, but I was for 4 years promoting pro wrestling events. So the idea of like what you were saying about having Vody resonated really strongly. You need to have your draw. You need to have your Hulk Hogan. Sure. So probably the first time Vody Bachman's been ever compared to Hulk Hogan. But
he is like a black belt in
jiu-jitsu. Maybe not a lot. He's a jiu-jitsu guy, right? Isn't he?
I think Vody could take Hulk these days.
I think so, yeah. Sure. Yeah, BJJ, get him on the mat, and then he's done.
But I was going to say one other thing, and maybe this is – I'm not trying to open too much of a can of worms, but you talked about community, Larson, and how important it is. And I was just hanging out with a bunch of guys that were formerly Mennonites. They're now Reformed Christians. They're thinking about actually joining the CRC, but they're up in Paris, Texas, and I was hanging out with a couple of them this last week, and they are the idea of community they have is so desirable, where basically all business is done within their community. A dollar circulates 10 or 12 times before it leaves, and all this different stuff. And that's just been on my head for about a week now. But I was going to say, relating back to, doing events and conferences for people, it's like, I love Canon Plus. I love Theopolis. I love all this stuff. It's great to listen to these titans of theology talk about stuff. But there's also something to, you go to a conference or you go to an event and you hear it, and then you walk out in the hallway and you talk and you kind of start engaging with how the practical applications of that stuff. And if you go to a good conference, the guy doesn't go to the green room and you never hear from him again. I'm a big fan of Grace Agenda up in Moscow. And, I'll get to hang out with the speakers for half an hour afterwards and just have a beer and chat with them and pick up some new ideas or some nuance. And I think doing an event has a communal element to it beyond just – being in person is great. I think listening and learning is great, but there's also an element of being around others as they're doing the same thing that I think really takes it to the next level.
Yeah, that's really, really good. And I think there's a lot of impatience right now, and understandably so, particularly on the part of young men, for teaching that is only abstract and that doesn't have application, that there's no, it's not obvious how this might change your life. So things that just seem to be a matter of just an intellectual exercise. Mm-hmm. And I think that can be a really healthy development. I think one thing that has plagued us in the Reformed Church for so long is that we are, if parts of the church have been anti-intellectual and underdeveloped in terms of their life of the mind and their understanding of theology and whatnot, we've had a tendency to go to the other extreme. I remember J.I. Packer years ago wrote a book called Rediscovering Holiness, and he kind of talked about different caricatures and had these little stick figures that kind of showed you these different how different traditions can get out of balance. And so the Reformed traditions just got this gigantic head on this little stick body, and then you might have others with gigantic arms and hardly any head. And obviously, you want to be well developed in every way. We want to be very well rounded, and we want to wrestle with the things we need to wrestle with at an intellectual level, with the scriptures and all of that. But it's, as Doug Wilson says, theology comes out our fingertips. It comes out of our hands and our feet, and it's got to shape what we do and how we actually live. And I definitely see a conference like what you're doing as an opportunity to hear the teaching and then immediately put it into practice. And I think we really need we need more of that kind of thing, where there's a really obvious connection between what we're hearing taught from the scriptures and, in this case, say a theology of work, and then figuring out how to live that out, put that into practice, how it works out on the ground. I think that's so important. And I think that's got a great deal of appeal right now, because I think that's what people are looking for.
Right.
Yes and amen. I think that was all great. And I would just say, bring it back to like the local church context. I think one of the things that I love about All Saints, but I love about the CREC as a whole, not to keep putting over the CREC because there's other great denominations out there, but one thing that's been really attractive to me and my family is, especially at All Saints, we go to worship and we have an excellent sermon, usually by Steve Jeffrey, and then we're exalted and we leave. We're commissioned and we go out, and then we're immediately fellowshipping or celebrating a baptism or doing something. But it's the immediacy of we're taking what we just learned in the sermon or in the context of the whole worship, and now we're immediately putting it into practice. And I think that that's something in the last few years. I think people are really, like, our church has kind of exploded. My understanding is in Huntsville, you guys have kind of had pretty similar explosion. Yeah. And I'm sure that it relates back to a lot of that. It's not just the talk, it's the doing that kind of gets implemented.
I think one helpful way to parse this actually is in the context of biblical wisdom. If you think of the book of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and all they have to say about kind of the realities of life, what they're saying in words is, you could parse it by saying this is stuff that you could learn from your father, from the wise old man at your church, as he leads you through the practicalities of real life. It's embodied discipleship. Now, of course, because it's scripture, it's encoded in words, so to speak. But there's an aspect of wisdom which is necessarily embodied and exemplary. And to put it in really crude terms, we've got the conference here is seeking to be normative, teaching from myself and a few other guys, and then situational and existential, as it's putting people in front of each other. And I'm hoping that what will happen to a whole bunch of these guys, men and women who come to this conference, is things that I'm sure are similar to what's happened to all of us in the past, where there's one or two conversations that we can point to, which we didn't realize at the time were set to decisively change the course of our lives. And I can point to 2 or 3 conversations, one about homeschooling, one about Christian ministry, a couple of other conversations that I've had, that really so much of what I thank God for about where I am now arose from those providential conversations, and they wouldn't have happened if I hadn't been put in the context where I've got people who are wiser than me around me, people who are more experienced than me, or people who've just got experience that I haven't had, even if they're kind of the same age as me. They've just thought through things that I've not done, and they're able to give me some of that wisdom. So this conference, I think, is one of the reasons I'm excited about it. People come to me with ideas all the time. I'm sure they do for you guys as well as pastors. And some of those ideas are not great ideas. This one,
well, there's this. I mean, this opens up a whole can of worms that we may or may not want to dive into, but just the idea that, like, I was listening to a podcast on Econ Talk with, I think it was Aaron Mastriani, talking about the difficulty of the reality that you can't reach the brain through the ears. Like it's very difficult to learn through just pure listening, and that's like the predominant, way that teaching is done. It seems, but then there's this Nassim Taleb has this book about skin in the game, and this idea that it's the same kind of idea that, like, until you're in a position to where you're actually using the information, like Kyle's talking about, you hear a sermon about community and about life in the body, and then you walk out the back doors into the fellowship hall and you start doing life with the body. You start putting it to work. It's like, if you don't have, like I tell people in business, people who are interested in getting an MBA or something, it's like, that's great, go for it if that's something you're excited or interested in. The reality is that you're going to have a hard time remembering even the names of the classes that you took in business school, after 5 years. But the first time you have to figure out how to make a distribution, of profits to your owners, you will learn about taxes and about, about contracts at a level that you'll never be able to learn it. And I can't sit here and lecture you on it and expect you to retain it. Like, you're going to have to be in a situation where you need that information in a practical way for it to really land, So I do. And it's the same problem we're talking about here. It's like, we want to talk to people about work. What I really want to do is talk to people who are working about their work, and have a dialogue about what's wisdom look like in this situation, what scripture teaches in this situation. And that's the conversation that I'm frustrated isn't happening enough at church or with my church friends, right? We get together and we circle the wagons and talk about our favorite, theological sort of hobby horse topics, or political topics. And nobody's saying, I'm trying to negotiate this contract. It's really difficult because X, Y, and Z, or I'm being sued by a partner. Like, how should I be thinking about this? Or I'm struggling with, with retaining good talent. Like, what am I doing wrong? Like, those are the conversations, I think, because ultimately, and I think this is where you guys are going to go with the conference, and I don't want to steal your thunder, but I think we're all probably in agreement here that work really is, if it's not the meaning of life, it's a very central, profound element of the image of God that we bear, and so it ought to be, it ought not to just be sort of a adjunct kind of, like, it's this sort of, it's this thing I have to do off on the side to make sure the bills are paid, but it's not really something that I think about or am passionate about or care about or talk about or whatever.
Larson, I think that's really, really good. And I do think it's true that there's a very real sense in which teaching can go in one ear and out the other unless you're starting to put it into practice. So think about how Paul organizes his epistles. It's very often theology in the early chapters and then the outworking of that in our lives in the rest of the book. And you can't have one without the other. If you go try to live a Christian life without the teaching that's foundational to it, obviously you'll go awry. Right. But if you don't put into practice what you've heard, that's going to slip away from you. Yep. So I think that's really, really important. I also tell people all the time, if there's some area that you want to master, always go to the practitioners, not to the theoreticians. Mm-hmm. I've seen this kind of mistake be made many times. So just to give you one example in church life, I've seen people read a stack of books on mercy ministry and think they know how to do it now, when they actually don't. And as soon as they set out to do something, they make a disaster, they make a mess of it. Right. And all kinds of terrible things happen, because you have to have a kind of street smarts. Right. You have to have a kind of just practical, sort of down in your bones kind of wisdom to go with your, let's say, theoretical knowledge of how these things actually, how it actually works, how it actually happens, what it actually takes to successfully minister to those in need. Or here's another example. You can go read a Chilton's auto repair manual and still not know anything about how to fix a car. What you actually need to do is lift up the hood with an experienced mechanic and let him show you around. And here's how you take this off and replace that part. And here's how you do these things. That's how you learn. It's got to be hands-on. It's the same thing we do with our kids. We don't just teach our kids, just ideas or concepts or principles, but we actually form them and shape them in such a way. We require them to live in such a way and to put these things into practice. I mean, if you're not doing that, I don't care what you teach as a parent, you're not going to get good results.
I was just thinking exactly the same, but what you said about kids. Pardon me intruding, Richie. I thought so this is how great fathers raise their sons. And it's certainly how apprenticeships work when they work well. And one way I think of framing this is, look, let's be honest, there's lots of guys out there, young men, perhaps especially in our circles, who are conscious, and they're increasingly conscious as they go further into adult life, that they haven't had the kind of practical experiential apprenticeship style training that their fathers would have loved to give them, or that they'd have loved to have in the professional domain that they're working in. I think of this as, in a sense, a super condensed 2-day apprenticeship, or at least planting the seeds of it. I mean, if I were thinking of starting a business, and somebody said I could, for a couple $100, I could sit down for dinner with David Rees, I'd be like, okay, where do I sign? You know what I mean? It's like this guy's the real deal. He's done it. He's doing it still. Just like the other speakers, if I was looking for a job or looking to hire new people, and somebody said, well, there's this conference where Andrew Krapachetz, the Red Balloon guy, is going to be one of the speakers, and he's going to be on tap talking to delegates for 2 days solid, plus the dinner the night before, I'd think, well, here's an opportunity to actually go and ask the particular and personal questions that I need to ask, and then actually just do whatever arrangements I might need to make. Maybe face to face with these guys at this event is the time to do it.
Yeah, and I was going to just throw in my little 2 cents on the practice, versus book learning versus putting it in practice. So I do jiu-jitsu, and this weekend I did a private class with a guy because he does a specific move that he's done on me. I've watched him do. I'm like, how the heck did you do that? And so I was like, skin in the game. I was like, I'm going to pay you for an hour of your time to teach me just that move. And this morning I was implementing it, and but I would want to say, well, first off, not only did he teach me and I had to put a time investment, I also asked him and I paid him to show me this specific thing. So this kind of skin in the game thing that I'm a big fan of. And that's one thing on the conference that I've been kind of trying to phrase to people is like, view this as like, it'll be fun. We're gonna have fellowshipping and we're gonna have some psalm singing and all that stuff. That'd be great, but really view it as an investment opportunity, because going back to something you were saying, Larson, one of the things that spurred me on to want to do this event was kind of, not that I'm Mr. figured it all out, have $1 million in the bank, but there's conversations I'm having with guys in our local context that I'm like, kind of dumbfounded on sometimes. Not that they're uneducated. That's not what I'm saying. But just maybe for example, a couple guys deciding to wait in 2021 to get a mortgage when interest rates are down. And then I'm trying to talk to them about renting versus a mortgage. And there's just not a conceptual understanding sometimes of how money should work for you. Now, again, not saying I have it all figured out by any means, but some of the other conversations, talking to guys that are like, I'm really struggling to pay ends meet right now because it is hard right now. Well, okay, how many hours are you working? Oh, 40. Okay, Can you get overtime? Well, maybe. Okay, well, could you get a second job and work 20 extra hours a week? 40 is not all that much. And again, just trying to talk to guys about work and how it relates back to their family, and looking at biblical principles and passages that relate to this. And there's some guys you kind of want to grab and say, like, look, Proverbs talks about providing an inheritance for your children's children. How are you working on that? Okay. Again, Larson, like I think you nailed it right in the head. There's certain conversations you have that are both, sometimes they're just like larger meta ideas relating back to theology, but you can boil them down into practical, but then sometimes they're just highly practical. And there's a couple times, there's been 1 or 2 guys in this congregation that have even been like, hey Kyle, like your lunch break seems to be a little long today. Is that all right? I appreciate them saying that, because I want to be held to a higher standard. Like I want to make sure that I'm not doing any disservice to my employers or anything like that. And those are just practical conversations that I think we need to have more of, because it's really easy to talk pedo communion, pedo baptism and all that stuff. But I think it's much harder to talk about these concepts if they relate back to a hard issue or practical.
Well, I think that's really good. And one thing I've noticed with a lot of young men is, I think about what's happened, and I don't know exactly when this started, but it seems like, and this is a point David Bahnsen makes, that so much of the church, say the church's teaching on work has been basically an attack on the dangers of overwork. And all of our analogies or examples are basically like, make sure you don't spend too much time at the office and that kind of thing, when actually that's not really our problem. So, it's the classic C.S. Lewis line, confronted with a flood, we break out the fire extinguishers. We are guarding against the wrong set of temptations. Really, the great problem facing us for most people in our culture is not overwork, it's underwork. And it's not having too much ambition for young men today. It's really not having enough drive or ambition. So that's one thing. But one thing I've seen that I think is very encouraging is I think that there is a new crop of up and coming young men, Christian men, based men, to steal from the name of your conference, who really do want to have a household where they are the primary provider and where their wife can primarily be devoted to nurturing and raising children, at least for as long as those children are in the home. And I think that's wonderful. But then the question is, how do you go about that? Because obviously we live in a world that is basically designed for a 2-income family. I mean, that, things are priced accordingly, and the workforce, we as women enter the workforce, obviously a lot more workers. That's one thing that's kind of kept wages down. And so what kind of things would you say? I'm asking all you guys, what kind of things would you say to a young man today who says, I want to be the primary provider for my family? I'm just starting out. What kind of things do I need to consider? Where should I invest my time, my energy? What kind of skills should I learn? What direction should I go if that's really my goal, to be the primary provider, the breadwinner for my household?
Well, one thing I'd say right off the bat, and this relates actually back to Steve and Larson's podcast they did here at All Saints a while back about red pilling. I would want to talk to a couple of these guys about making sure that their motivations are not, what was the phrase, Chad home, where it's like the priority is like, go live in the wilderness, start a farm. And I'm seeing this in conservative circles where I would want to kind of make sure that the motives are on point. You're doing this because you think this is genuinely best for your family. I think we would all pretty much agree that, mom being at home with the little ones and dad making earning the bacon, mom making the bacon, I think are good things. But I do want to caution and say I've seen in Twitter sphere or wherever, Facebook groups, where guys are kind of doing this, and I'm trying to make sure that the motives are kind of lined up properly. They're aligned with Scripture. But I would, if you find a guy, even if he does have bad motives, you still want to encourage good behavior. And so one of the things I would say is, things are tough right now. I've told people for years, this is before, interest rates have gotten ridiculous, is I've told guys for a while, like, man, living in a trailer home might be better than renting a one room apartment, both on a practical level, but also like you're owning land. You would own something, and there's something to that value that's beyond just monetary. I think there's something spiritual to men laboring over their own land. So that'd be one area I want to go. But I just wanted to throw out that red pill thing because I think it's really important that we're trying to make sure guys get the motives kind of more on track, even if they're not quite off track. If that makes sense.
The motives point brings to mind what you mentioned, Rich, about the ambition element. I think we probably still do have a little bit of work to do to clear the spiritual decks about ambition. And so let's just say, of course, it's possible to be selfishly ambitious, to be ambitious in a self-aggrandizing fashion, or in a way which neglects the goal of our ambitions being to provide for ourselves, to love our families, to be able to provide for them so we can be generous to others who are in need and so on. So if we just clear that out of the way, and then we say, okay, with that caveat, ambition is a profoundly good thing. Like the cultural mandate, Genesis 1:26 to 28, is about the most ambitious command ever issued until it was superseded by the Great Commission, right? So the living God is in the business of giving men and women extremely ambitious targets to achieve, extremely ambitious aspirations to harbor. Now, what that means is, if we view it in that framework, what we've done theologically is we've connected the pastoral locus of ambition with the theological locus of eschatology. In other words, we're saying ambition is the disposition that we should have towards the part that we play in God's plan for the world. Now, then we extend that self-consciously down through the number of generations that the living God says he's going to take, minimum 1,000 generations of those who love me. And we're thinking, okay, so we're one tiny cog in a very, very large God-glorifying machine. But still, we have the responsibility for these people around us. I've got my family. If you're married with children, you have your children. You've got your church community, the men and women who could come to depend on you if you're able to provide for them. And we want to teach people to frame those practical opportunities within the theological matrix of, okay, this is what God has given me to do in the world. You mentioned David Barneson's recent book on this point. He's one of his podcasts. He's recently brought out a bunch of recordings from his late father, Greg Barneson, who's making repeatedly the point that blessedly, I think we can, we've learned so many times we could take for granted, but let's restate it anyway, that work is a good gift of God before the fall. It's sweat that is the curse, not work. And so by working in the world, by taking what God has made good and seeking to mix it with our labor to make it better, we are participating in God's plan for the world. And really what's happened in the modern economy is just there's a whole bunch of more abstracted ways of doing that, which are more information-based, it's knowledge work and so on, but it's still work. We're still laboring in the world to take the created gifts of God and make good things even better. And it's a wonderful, God-glorifying thing to do.
Totally right. And I think in the modern economy, I think what people, and Rich and I have talked about this 2 or 3 different times. We had a whole episode about homesteading versus, kind of knowledge economy, working in the city. And then we got into a long conversation about this, I think, on our podcast with Bonson. But the point to make, I think, that not only, I think you said that in the knowledge economy, that work is it's perhaps less obvious, maybe, is what you said, or
it's more abstracted from the concrete.
I would say it's more abstractive,
things,
and it's much more potent. It's much more efficient. You're actually doing way more from your desk with your computer and your cell phone. You're actually doing far more if you're doing it well, obviously, than your great grandfather ever could in a day. Working with hand tools, right? And so I think that's the thing that like our dominion taking powers, with the tools we have at our disposal now, should be far greater than ever in the history of mankind. The problem is that the only people who are ambitious, it seems, anymore are not Christians. And so Kyle made the point earlier that we're trying to see what economists call the multiplier effect, right? Of every dollar I spend bouncing around my local economy multiple times. That doesn't happen. I was just at a conference in Oklahoma a couple weeks ago about healthcare, the Free Market Medical Association. And a guy put up a slide where he showed that a typical town of 10,000 people spends on average annually $140 million in healthcare, right? If you add up what they're spending on their insurance policies, if you're adding up, all the costs, right? $140 million. A town budget for a town that big is only 40 million. And if you think about where all of that money is going, that 140 million a year in a town of 10,000, it is like a pipeline of wealth that is just flowing directly out of the community. It's going to like one of the big 5 insurance companies. It's going probably to some huge megacorp healthcare system that owns the local hospital. It's going all the employers of all of those physicians, are not local. They're all big mega corps. I mean, all of that money is just going straight out of your economy. And so that's one example of thousands, in your local community, where because some ambitious people elsewhere have basically colonized your community and extracted, extracting all of the wealth from your community, because nobody in the community is actually saying, "Hey, I'm ambitious for this my people. I want to actually do something that's going to enrich my community." And I think about it like I'm trying to make Huntsville a sanctuary city for God's people. I want to see, by the time I die, I would like for people to look back and say, Huntsville is better today than it was, a generation ago. It's easier to be a Christian here. It is more glorious. It is easier to live faithfully. It's easier to provide for my family. It's easier to live, anyway, all of those things. So I think that's kind of big picture mission, for guys, I think, in our communities. But I think we've just lost sight of this incredible opportunity to transform, as the Great Commission, as the creation mandate instructed. We've lost sight of this opportunity we have, even as knowledge workers, to transform the little corner of the earth God's given us into.
Larson, if I can jump in here, I'll just say I think Huntsville will be much better for Larson Hicks having lived there. I dare say the state of Alabama will be much better off for Larson Hicks having lived
very
there.
Early, Rich, very early.
Few things I want to follow up on. One, the homesteading thing is interesting. I think it's, for the vast majority of people, it's extremely inefficient.
Yeah.
I would say homesteading tends to be what I would call a luxury belief of the right.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that nobody should do it. I'm just saying for most people, it's going to be terribly inefficient. Yeah. So that's something to keep in mind. I do think that there are people out there who are sort of setting that up as an ideal, and I think that's going to be misleading and sort of a dead end for a lot of people who might be considering going that route. A few other things, I mentioned, young men who want to be providers and all of that. And I think there's even something of it's kind of like a form of psychological warfare, propaganda campaign that's basically aimed at wearing down young people, telling them it's just too hard. So you'll own nothing and you'll like it. You'll never have a house. Your wife will always have to work outside the home, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's just too hard. And I think one thing we have to recognize is that, sure, there are things about it that are hard today for young people starting out. I mean, I've got 4 kids who are young adults, 3 of whom are married. I mean, they're, so I see what it's like with them. I mean, I know how difficult it can be. But the reality is, every generation has its challenges. And I'm not really convinced there's anything uniquely difficult. Yeah. I mean, there are certainly things that are somewhat different, but there's nothing uniquely difficult that young people are facing today. But I do think there's this propaganda campaign that wants to make them think it's just too hard. So why even bother? Just vote for the welfare state. Let us take care of you, and your ambition's not going to lead to anything fruitful anyway. I mean, Kyle, I'm not picking on you here by saying this, but I mean, what you said about interest rates, that interest rates are ridiculously high. Well, the reality is, they're really not. I mean, historically speaking, interest rates are really not that high.
That's true.
Yeah.
Now, they were held really artificially low for a period of time. Yeah. But the reality is, when my parents first bought a house, interest rates were more than double what they are right now. Yeah. So, I mean, there are people who are alive today who paid much higher interest on their first mortgage than what a young person today would pay. When I got 7-point-something% on my first house, people were like, "Oh, you got such an amazing rate. I can't believe rates are so low." And now we're saying how that's so high. So a lot of that's just a matter of perspective. But I think one way we can encourage young people is by telling them, you know what, it's really not that hard. If you will be wise, if you will plan your life out in accord with God's law and God's design for humanity, for family, for work, if you will make good decisions, you've still got an excellent opportunity to have a happy and prosperous and fruitful life. In other words, the book of Proverbs, the generalizations we find in Proverbs continue to be true even in 2024. Even under the Biden regime, the book of Proverbs is still true, believe it or not.
Yeah.
And I think that's really, really important for us to encourage young people with. And then one other thing, you guys, Larson, you had Santiago Pliego on your show.
Yeah.
So I'm sure you've read the Vibe Shift article. I don't know if you other
great.
guys.
Yeah, we talked a lot about it.
It's just an interesting article, and it's really encouraging because I do think there's something of a vibe shift taking place. Sure. And it's, one of the things he talks about in that article is, for example, Elon Musk doing us all a favor. I don't want to overstate the case and say he saved free speech, but there's a certain sense in which he did at least give us one platform that would be insulated from a lot of government censorship, which is wonderful. But more than that, the fact that you've got so many young, conservative Christian men who are ambitious, who want to do a Silicon Valley kind of thing, but they want to do it with a different kind of politics and a different worldview driving it. To me, that's really, really exciting. And I think there are just tremendous opportunities out there for young men who are enterprising, who are willing to learn the skills they need to, who've got the drive, the ambition to go make something happen. I think there are tremendous opportunities out there right now for young men to go do really incredible things and be paid quite handsomely for doing it.
Totally.
I think you and me, Rich, are looking at the same coin, just different ways. Because I would agree with you, like on the interest rates thing, you're absolutely right. Like it historically, you're exactly right. But I think, so you were saying, I want to say this though, you had said it's actually not that hard for guys right now. And I want to spin that a little bit and say, even if it is hard, here's our second Doug Wilson quote. Why are we going to train our kids to fight dragons and then be upset when there's dragons? Yep. You know what I mean? So even if it is harder today to like start a business, like, and Larson, I'd love to hear, you started a far more successful business than I have. So I'd love to hear your take on this, but even if it is harder to start a business today than it was even a couple years ago or 5 years or 10 years or 20 years ago, that doesn't really give us an excuse as Christians. Mm-hmm. And we were saying this on another podcast, but I'm a big believer of saying, whether it's easy or whether it's hard, you just got to do it. So
well, I think it's.
I was just going to say, without having thought a ton about it, I really don't think it's ever been easier than it is now. Honestly, I think the hardest part is finding talented people, hardworking people. Those are the things that are in short supply. Mm-hmm. But if you yourself are a hardworking person with good communication skills, work ethic, and are willing to confront people, and have conflict, right? And even just, I'll give an example. A young man in our church moved out here, was a pastor in a Baptist church, became Reformed, visited a few communities and settled on Huntsville, and sends an email. 6 months in, less than 6 months in, maybe 3 months into living in Huntsville, sends an email saying, I've started a business. It's in an industry that I used to work in. I'm looking for $50,000. I'm happy to structure it as a loan. Here's a slide deck of just explaining my business and a little video of me talking about it. It was 72 hours before he sent the follow-up email. I'm taken care of. Thank you. I don't need any more money. Right. Yeah. And it was just, wow. Yeah, and behind the scenes, guy had gone to an older guy, and by older, I'm talking a few years older, still a very young man in our church, and said, could you help me put together a slide deck? And the guy said, oh, for sure. So it was just like, have some community, avail yourself of the wisdom that is right there in your backyard, and just get out there and do something. He could have sat around and complained that there wasn't a company in Huntsville that did the work that he went to school for, right? Or he's a pastor and you can't make a living as a pastor anymore, because the pay rates for pastors are so terrible. Dude just just got after it. Right. And anyway, I'll stop.
Well, let me put it this way. Let's make it multiple choice. You're an 18-year-old. Okay. Would you rather be an 18-year-old in 1914, 1929, 1944, or 2024?
Yeah.
Okay. 1914,
which one
going off to fight World War I.
Yeah.
2029, hey, the Depression just started.
That's right.
1944, hey, you're going to go jump out of an airplane and go fight Nazis in Europe, or whatever. 2024, I mean, what, your Wi-Fi might go out every now and then. And like, what's your big challenge? It just, I think that actually, it is our prosperity and our affluence that have actually made us very soft. And so then we hit a speed, not even a pothole, but a speed bump. And we think, oh no, something disastrous has happened. And a lot of it is because we just don't, previous generations rode around on roads with lots of potholes, but they had shock absorbers and they could absorb the impact and keep going. Yeah. And now you've got a generation up and coming that's so fragile, so brittle, it doesn't take very much to break them. And I would say that if you're a young man today and you decide, I'm just going to work hard. I'm just going to put my nose to the grindstone. I'm going to be ambitious. I'm going to seek out help and be an apprentice if that's what I need to do to learn the skills, whatever I need to do to get the skills. And I'm going to just put myself out there again and again and again. I think you've got an amazing opportunity to be really successful. And I definitely think you'll stand out against your peers. I mean, one thing I would say is that, if you're a young man today, the competition's actually not that tough because so many guys are just kind of drifting along and getting high on marijuana and whatever. And if you, whether addicted to porn or whatever. So if you will lock down and work and be disciplined, you've just got amazing opportunities to stand out from the crowd. And then just, I think the world will open up for you.
100%.
I think part of the challenge for men is a framing problem. So we hear a lot in our particular small corner of the Reformed world, and actually in the broader Reformed world, about the fight. The battle or the war within our culture is part of the symbolic and metaphorical toolkit that we use to depict our life in the world. But we routinely connect that metaphorical framework with conflict against secular powers which we imagine to be greater than us. And then we do the woke thing of making ourselves the victim. Whereas if what we can do is deploy that symbolic worldview in the context of the workplace, we'll suddenly find that we have actually a bunch of pastoral and volitional resources to help us to confront what challenges there are. So you're right. Maybe the challenges that we have on average now are more or less than at various points in history. Hardly matters. The spread is going to be greater than the difference in the mean anyway. But the point is, whether you've got challenges large or small, how we should think of those is as the battle that we are called to wage in the world. And from a pastoral standpoint, I don't have the business expertise that men in my congregation have, but I have conversations with guys who are in business, who are coming for advice, and they're sometimes coming for encouragement. They're a little discouraged. One of the things I'm trying to do is to get them to see the discouragements, to see the frustrations, let's say the difficulty of getting a loan at an interest rate they can afford, or the difficulty of finding good staff, or the difficulty of retaining good subcontractors. Trying to see those difficulties as, well, this is the battle the Lord has given you. Okay, so all of the rhetorical and symbolic and pastoral resources that you are being given by all the stuff you're listening to online all the time about the fight, this is the fight for you. Your fight is not on Capitol Hill. Your fight is not on college campuses waving stupid flags around. Your fight is in the workplace, and it's the employee that isn't pulling his weight, and it's the customer that wants something for nothing, and it's the difficulty of getting the job done. Right. That's the fight, and to get in the fight.
I've loved all the attention that I think the scientific term is the dopaminergic system, has received in some literature. I think Michael Foster's book talks about this, but I know a lot of other places. But just this idea that God's built into our biology this system of reward for accomplishing difficult things. So like you see a pile of wood that needs to be chopped and stacked, and and then you do it and you look back at it and you get this biological response that feels good. And that's just been hacked by video games.
There's so many shortcuts.
Social media and and then you compound this by you're kind of getting the dopamine, your dopamine system's been hacked. You're getting blackpilled by public school system against capitalism, by mainstream media, against capitalism, by 4chan and Reddit and wherever else you're hanging out online against, boomers and your victim status, and just all this stuff, is sort of compounds. And so I think Rich is onto something, that it's not that situations any worse. It's just we're the baseline level of sort of resilience versus fragility is way out of whack.
Do you think that there's an element? I think about this a lot. In our church, we last year we added 4 deacons, and so we did a study on what are the qualifications for becoming a deacon, and really they were still most of them are about personal growth and really clearing up sin in your own life. And I think about that relating back to some of this, where it's like, we were talking about, somebody mentioned pornography, and it's like pornography is the ultimate do zero work and get all the reward, right? And our society is pornified. Everything is video game. Like I like video games. I'll play them from time to time. But I will admit, the big problem with video games is the achievements are so low, and there's a fantasy element of, like, especially with certain games, where it's like you're living out something that you probably couldn't do in real life, but you should be striving
virtual
to do.
Dominion.
And you, exactly. And so our whole society is set up like this. And I think that a lot of the conversation we're having, I think, comes back to we need to encourage men to clean up their lives through the power of God, through the power of the gospel, through the power of preaching and the power of fellowship, community, all that stuff. Be in a good church where you're going to be challenged to overcome temptation, porn, whatever it may be. So that you can live out the ambition that God has given you. And I do think there's an ambition problem. I for sure think that's true, but I also think it's suppressed. I think men do have a lot of ambition. That's why porn is so powerful, because it plays off of that. And so for me, I think a lot of the conversation we're talking about comes back to the fact that we want to encourage men to clean up their lives so that they can get that ambition rightly ordered. And I think that a lot of that comes through being married, having children, working hard, being a good member of a church. And so I think on the, coming back to the Workspace Conference, I do want to have an element to this that is talking about men and personally cleaning up their act, to speak plainly.
Well, to cite yet another Doug Wilsonism, civilization is built by men who have mouths to feed. And so, yes, I agree with you. I mean, so that's what's going to harness a man's energy and ambition. It means G.K. Chesterton talks about how the soldier fights not because he hates what's in front of him so much, but because he loves what is behind him. Right. Why does a man go and labor in a coal mine or, do some other difficult job all these hours, day after day after day? Well, it's not because he may or may not love the work. You may or may not find great fulfillment in your work. It's wonderful if you do, but that doesn't always happen. But you do it because the work's good and important in itself. It's a way of furthering dominion. And also you've got a family you love that you're seeking to provide for. So I think that's really, really crucial. And I do think that there's a huge problem in our culture with young men. And, Larson, you called it virtual dominion. I think that's exactly right. I think that's a huge issue. So porn gives a man a sense of sexual release and sexual fulfillment without having to actually work to court a woman and marry her and then care for her and love her. But I will say this, men who use porn find very quickly that it emasculates them and it brings them shame and it puts them on a downward spiral. Mm-hmm. So actually, I think a lot of times you can tell the young men who are addicted to porn because it's like a drug addict, really. It's like you can tell they're just sapped of their masculine energy.
Yeah.
Video games are not there's not the same kind of moral issue with video games typically, but if you play video games a whole lot more than you should, it can have the same impact in the sense of draining your ambition, and you're getting a sense of accomplishment without having really accomplished anything. Right. You're getting that dopamine hit without having actually done the work that should have been connected to it.
The same can be said for internet debates, on internet forums. It's another form of virtual potency. I think of the Proverbs, Proverbs 5, drink water from your own cistern, flowing from your own well. Should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the streets. And it goes on just to talk about how a husband should be delighted in his wife. And just this idea you quoted Pastor Wilson on men, civilization being built by men with mouths to feed. It's also built by men who are trying to impress a woman or trying to get a wife, right? I mean, this is George Gilder's book is all about this idea that men, that a healthy Christian society is one where men, in order to gain access to a wife, to sex, and to a wife, he has to prove competence. Competence across a number of dimensions, and it would be shameful to even think about pursuing a woman, if you didn't feel competent, to provide. And so think about this. We've also short circuited that.
How many great love songs could have been written but were not because a man settled for pornography? That's or right. How many great innovations could have been made if a man is like, I've got to do something with my life, provide for a woman, but then he settles for pornography, so he doesn't make the innovation. Right. How much have we lost out on? There's no telling. But just to kind of tie off the thread that we've talked about as far as whether or not it's harder today than in the past. I actually preached a sermon recently that was on a big chunk out of Hebrews chapter 12 with the title or subtitle, Why It's a Good Thing Your Life is Hard. And basically with the understanding that God has designed the Christian life as an obstacle course. Yeah. Your life is difficult by design. And certainly every generation will have its own challenges. Your life will have its own peculiar challenges. There are challenges that are particular to just you, even apart from whatever generation or time period you might live in. But if we want to talk about living in a difficult time, of course, the words of Gandalf come to mind when Frodo says he wished it hadn't happened in his time, all of this business with the ring. And Gandalf says, so do I, and so do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. And those are words to live by. I mean, those are words of wisdom. Mm-hmm. You don't get to decide what era you live in. Had you lived in another era, you might have found yourself a soldier fighting a world war. That's right. Or you might have found yourself battling a depression. But you live in this particular time, and these are your particular battles. Don't get distracted by how things might have been different. Focus on the world as it actually is, as God in His providence has given it to you, and then go run your race. If this is the obstacle course, go run it as best you can.
It's good. It's a good word.
Amen.
Pastor Jeff.
Kyle, one other question I wanted to ask you. Tell us about the name of the conference.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, great. I'm going to tell you the story, and then we can talk about the quick little theology behind it. But I was in my kitchen, and it just kind of came to me. Truth be told, I actually don't use – I think I've used on Twitter once the phrase based. I actually don't care for it, but it's common. It's people are using it. So I'm just kind of sitting there, I was thinking like works-based faith. Oh, okay. And I think recently we had a sermon on James.
A couple of years ago. Good memory.
But I thought it was like pretty funny. I told my wife, I was like, what do you think about this name? And she just laughed and she's like, okay. So then I was like, well, Pastor Jeffrey's on board if he's okay with it. If the dry-witted British pastor is okay with the name of it,
I'll do my best.
We'll be okay with it. And I told him, hey, this is what we're thinking of the name, and I haven't seen you laugh as hard at it.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty funny. I mean, it's picking up on at least one set of double meanings. So the contemporary based as opposed to debased, work is the thing that any competent, ambitious, thoughtful, energetic human being ought to be pursuing. It's also, and this is picking up a couple of thoughts I had in response to one of to the things you guys said earlier. It is unashamedly shouting from the rooftops that the faith that saves us is not a mere cognizance or assent to certain true religious claims. It is a disposition towards Christ, which is inevitably and invariably accompanied by a thirst for action and a commitment to action. The faith that saves is never alone. You've heard all the kind of hackneyed but all too true theological catchphrases. So work is the thing that a based man would do. We unashamedly want to say that the faith that saves produces good works, and it produces work specifically. Not just good deeds, deeds of charity, deeds of kindness, though of course it does, but actual hard grind, not 9 to 5, 7:30 to 6, and then some, from guys who realize that is connected to God's plan for them and God's plan for the world.
It's good.
That's really good.
I figure you guys are just trying to see if you could get Series C people in more hot water.
There's a little bit of a troll in there.
Not from me, I hasten to add, but yeah. You think it's possible to get Series C guys in more hot water? I'd be interested to know how.
Where there's a will, there's a way.
Anyway, that's the subject for another day, probably.
Well, it's been really fun talking to you guys. We're excited about what you're doing here. If it's happening, remind us the dates of the conference.
Yeah, so it's June 20th and 29th here in Fort Worth, Texas, at the Hilton downtown.
The way you say that, by the way, if I were listening, I'd think you said 20th. It's 28th.
28th,
right?
yeah.
28th and 29th, Friday and Saturday.
Yes,
I'm correcting your American.
No,
I'm
thank
sorry
you.
about that.
No, it's fine. On the last podcast, I caught that too. I was like, I said that wrong. So it's the 28th and the 29th here in Fort Worth. We do have a speakers dinner the night before on the 27th.
Which is for delegates if they want to come. They have to sign up. There's an extra cost for that. But you want to have dinner with David Bunsen? I do.
Yeah, Sierra Wiley, right? David Reese, Pastor Jeffrey, great guys. Yeah, it's great. And so tickets are available at worksbased.com. I'm still shocked we got that URL, but it's as it says, it's worksbased.com.
That's awesome.
Great.
Well, thanks guys. I'm glad you're doing this and looking forward to hearing about how the conference goes and sort of hoping that I can get out of whatever it was I'm supposed to be doing at that time so I can go myself.
Well, if not, Larson, I'm going to be contacting you for Workspace 2025.
Awesome. Sounds good.
All right.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, all the best.
Trust you guys.
See ya.
The God a Minute podcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. If you like this podcast, you might enjoy one of our other podcasts, The Good Life Podcast, featuring Matt Carpenter interviewing experts in their field about how their work contributes to the good life.